Thank you for coming to Equality Bahamas Global 16 Days campaign. Originally started by the Center for Women's Global Leadership in 1991, it runs from November 25th to December 10th, and this year we are focused on claiming our rights. This event is the third event in this year's series. All events can be found on our Luma page, luma.com/16days25. A bit about Equality Bahamas. We're a feminist organization that promotes women's and LGBTQI plus people's rights as human rights through advocacy, public education, and community engagement, like this evening. The obligatory, no misogynistic, racist, classist, ableist language will be tolerated. You will be kicked out of the meeting with no warning. Tonight, we're speaking with Yemi Knight and Kendria Ferguson. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves, please?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kendria Ferguson. I am climate resilience, disaster risk management. I wear many hats when it comes to professions, but I am also a PhD student at University of West Indies, Mona, and my PhD is focused on sustainable development, and more specifically, Hurricane Dorian and the socioeconomic impacts of that hurricane on Abaco and Grand Bahama. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yemi. I hail from Barbados, and I operate at the intersection of human rights and environmental justice. I founded an organization called Anchor Bridge Environmental, which does local work in Barbados, but also regional work around including marginalized groups in environmental decision-making, projects, policies, et cetera, and that's it.
Thank you both. As usual, we'll have a brief guided discussion, and then everyone can come in with their questions. You can leave it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. For those of you on Facebook, you can comment in the chat box. So for both of you, what does disaster preparedness entail, and how does it connect with disaster recovery?
So I guess I'll get us started. So disaster preparedness, we often think of it as just simply, getting water and food and batteries and those materialistic items within a household. But for small islands like the Bahamas, especially us that has multiple islands, disaster preparedness was really rooted in our early warning communications, our understanding of risk, especially at the local level. And also financial preparedness, whether houses have access to finances to invest in those early materials, but also post-recovery needs, whether they have access to insurance. What we saw with Hurricane Dorian, social networks was very important, especially within family islands. So preparedness has a big role within our social networks and our small communities. And so when you talk about preparedness, that's really setting us up to be able to recover quicker and to also recover in an equitable way. And so when you want to connect that to preparedness and that reduces in losses, and it protects life and it speeds up recovery. And in many ways, it overall reduces how our human and financial systems within our islands are impacted and the overall cost of disaster.
Okay, I'll just jump right in there. Yeah, you'll hear a lot of terms: response, risk reduction, preparedness, and they all have different steps in there. And sometimes it can be complicated even for me, but I like to break it down quite simply. So there's something called prevention. So this is like taking an audit of what infrastructure might be neglected, what social systems are in place that might be negatively impacted during a natural hazard. Actually, that's something else I also want to say. Some agencies like the UN make a distinction between a natural hazard and a natural disaster. So a natural hazard is something that is like, naturally occurring earthquake, a hurricane that's happening naturally. That's a hazard. It only becomes a disaster when we, as humans, fail to respond adequately. So the disaster only occurs when people suffer and when we don't have, again, these things in place that I'm going to talk about shortly. Cool. So prevention. Auditing was going on infrastructurally. Auditing was going on in like your planning in terms of how you respond to particular hazard. The next thing is the mitigation. So is there something you can do before the disaster to strengthen the infrastructure that I spoke about? Is there something you can do to communicate with, for example, vulnerable groups and make sure that they're responding adequately, like providing supplies or telling them where to go for shelter, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so I mentioned prevention, mitigation. The next step is preparedness. So that looks like training and sensitizing disaster responders. So the mandate in the Caribbean is that they take care of everybody, but we know that that's not what happens. People who are homeless or houseless might get different treatment. Women get different treatment. LGBTQ people get different treatment. And in the case of the Bahamas, we know that some Haitian migrants also got treated differently. So that training would look like sensitizing disaster responders, be it through government agencies or volunteer agencies, on the unique experiences of these groups. Then the response, I think I'm repeating things, but that happens before, during, and after, and that encompasses everything that I just spoke about, and some more, I think that we'll get into. And then the last bit is recovery. So we've made a bunch of mistakes. What can we do to learn from what happened, who were neglected, and that then starts to cycle over again, which is prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery.
Thank you very much. You're making my job easy. What that you guys have seen are the challenges around evacuation, and specifically, what are the issues with mandatory evacuation?
I'll let Yemi start this one.
That's no problem. Evacuation and mandatory evacuation. So this is an interesting one because in many ways, evacuation shouldn't be mandatory. There's this new emerging conversation about having the right to stay, and the right to stay because people want to maintain their connection to the land, the relationships they've built with people around them, the culture. So there's this conversation about the right to stay, and that acknowledging especially natural hazards that are induced by climate change is not a burden for the individual community, but a responsibility of corporations or whomever else. Next thing is understanding what evacuation can look like. There's something called internal displacement, and Bahamians, you may know about this because you have various islands. So people may have moved from one island to another, and that's considered internal displacement. Or if you come from a very large landmass, like let's say Cuba, you can move from one region to the other in Cuba. And so that's something to consider. And that the challenges that arise there is that you might be from the same country, the same island, you may experience different treatment. Maybe people from one location is discriminated against for whatever reason. And then also something that I think people don't recognize, which is the importance of the social bonds that individuals make. So by being displaced, even though it's in your same country, you may lose the safety, the protection, and the community that you once had. And that is a challenge. And then obviously there's the differentiated impacts on people who are, women, queer people, people with disabilities. And that's something I also want to talk about, which is some shelters, or most shelters actually in the region, are not equipped for the different experiences that these groups have. Like some people with disabilities, for example, and I heard this from a colleague in Barbados, she is paralyzed from the chest down, and staying at home is actually, from her perspective, is a lot safer and than going to a shelter, because it's likely that the people there, the staff, might not be able to adequately take care of her. She's more vulnerable in that setting than she would be at home. So people might just brave it at home. In St. Vincent, during the ashfall, a lot of women chose to stay home for a different reason, but similar, which is, the fear of sexual harassment, et cetera, et cetera. And then the same thing can also occur for LGBTQ individuals. The next thing is, let's say we now have to evacuate to a different country. Now you have to adopt to certain social norms. So let's say you come from a Caribbean island, I'm speaking for LGBTQ people, where you may be safer in your country for the most part, as safe as you could be, and then you may be taken to another country where the social norms are a little different. That's also a challenge. And the last but most crucial thing is that internationally there's no legal protection, or there's protection gaps when it comes to migration laws. So there's no such thing as legally as a climate refugee. The only terminology that's used right now is a climate migrant, and some migration laws, policies, treaties out there don't necessarily explicitly protect that category of people. So there's a lot of legal migration barriers in that regard. And the next thing, when it comes to LGBTQ people, there are very few migration treaties or laws, policies, etc., frameworks that speak to LGBTQ experiences and the protection of those types of climate or environmental migrants. I think that's it.
Yemi brought up some really good points, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities and some of those systematic inequalities and social inequalities that exist for communities. The big part about evacuation, especially for the Bahamas, and we just saw it with Hurricane Melissa, is that evacuation puts a lot of pressure on government systems. And so when you're trying to take families away from their islands and more than likely bring them to Nassau. We know family islands don't like Nassau. They don't want to be away from home for very long. As soon as the storm passed, they're ready to get home to start rebuilding or looking at damage, and they're quick to get back to their normal routine. One of the challenges that I recognize that we have here is that it's never a thought out process. When you're sending a plane down to remove people from their island, we love the pomp and pageantry about it, but once you get them in a shelter, how are you caring for them? Not even food-wise or medical-wise, but how are you caring for them psychologically? We don't think about that. How are you supporting kids and those vulnerable groups, the elderly, pregnant females, or even those who may have disabilities within these shelters? And with doing that, we also have to recognize that you have to be prepared to house people for extended period of time. It's like we don't think beyond 1 or 2 nights. We don't think that they may be there for a week, or they may be there for an extended period of time. They need additional help when they go back to their island. And so what we just saw with Hurricane Melissa is that after a couple of days, those people was ready to go home, and rightfully so. Like, nobody wants to be away from their home for that long, especially when you don't know the level of damage that was done to your home. And so if you're going to have mandatory evacuations, which at this point and the level of damage the Bahamas has been facing over probably the last 10 years from hurricanes, it is definitely going to be part of our disaster response strategy, because we cannot relocate people to higher ground. We just don't simply have that landscape. But if you are going to do mandatory evacuations, it has to be done and rooted within human rights. And we are not there yet. We're missing a lot of components when it comes to taking care of people on a daily basis, especially when they are in vulnerable positions, such as waiting to understand how their homes and their communities will be affected.
All right, thank you both. The next question, we can start with Yemi. What are the unique vulnerabilities faced by particular groups of people in the Caribbean?
Yeah, before I answer that, I just want to echo and piggyback off of what Kendria said, which is about recovery is a long-lasting thing. And you're absolutely right. It's happening with people in Jamaica, where a lot of effort happens in the first days, weeks, but then people don't think about recovery years later, multiple years later. And so that's something that I would really like to flag. And I hope that in the work that Equality Bahamas does, and even myself now, because I'm thinking about it, is if I decide to do any more disaster recovery, maybe thinking about intervention 6 months to a year after the fact, just so that people are continually cared for. So what are the unique vulnerabilities faced by particular groups of the Caribbean? So we already have discrimination. That's a societal norm that we have. So cultural, social attitudes towards people who are different, LGBTQ people, but that comes from old colonial laws, colonial laws legislation that explicitly discriminated against LGBTQ individuals. We've seen some repealing of those laws in recent years, but those social attitudes still persist. The thing about those social attitudes is that they do permeate other laws, especially existing migration laws, and this is certainly throughout the English-speaking Caribbean. So you can look at some migration laws, and they have is labeled differently in different countries, but people who are barred entry to certain countries, and they'll say things like idiots, fools, imbeciles, perverts, like those types of people are barred entry. Those exact words are in a few laws or migration laws around the region, and you can look those up, and they're still in place. So what this means is that that entry is up to the discretion of the immigration lawyer. I'm not saying that these things are completely enforced, but it's up to the discretion of the immigration lawyer. And if they decide that they don't like you, then that means that you could be barred entry. And that means that LGBTQ people with disabilities, technically are not allowed to migrate to some Caribbean islands for tourism or otherwise. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's the truth. What else is there? I spoke about international frameworks, agreements, and treaties that don't necessarily consider the unique experiences of LGBTQ people. What you'll hear from people in the disaster risk reduction, preparedness, response realm is that they have a clause where they, treat everybody, all humans, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it's up to the discretion of the responder. If that person is homophobic, you might get different treatment. I will start calling out some names of some migration frameworks, agreements, and treaties that do have some language about LGBTQ considerations. So this is the one is called the Brazil Declaration and Plan of Action around Migration. You can look that up. There's the Inter-American Principles on the Rights of All Migrants, Refugees, stateless persons, and victims of human trafficking. Then there's one out of the Caribbean, I think, either Caribbean or Latin America and the Caribbean, which is called the Multi-Country Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. And then lastly, and most recently, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights Advisory Opinion that came out May 29th. They acknowledge that LGBTQ people experience different treatment and worse treatment during disasters. And this is a plug for myself to prove that or to validate that experience. They actually cited my paper. And so that's something you could go and read and you can use in your advocacy now. I don't know if I answered your question. but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would just add, and we saw it in the Bahamas, but I'm also seeing it now as recovery plays out in Jamaica. Geographic isolation is a major issue, and that's inter-island isolation as well as intra-country. So for many of our islands, they do not have access to functioning shelters. Shelters are churches and schools, which are not built to be shelters. And in Dorian, many of them were severely damaged. Additionally, they don't have access to hospitals, clinics are subpar, and so they don't have access to that emergency services needed for any sort of disaster level. So that in itself will create a greater vulnerabilities before any hazard has arrived. And we're also seeing that in Jamaica happen where you have communities that are a bit more isolated, have yet to receive aid on levels that they actually need to really help them recover. And then another vulnerability that I recognize that we never address is economic security. We are very dependent on tourism, and for our family islands, they are very dependent on international tourism, whether it is by sea and plane. And with recent changes in marine laws, we're seeing already a decline in boating within the islands, especially within those high tourist islands like Exuma and Eleuthera. We're seeing declines like that. And so when you are playing with tourism or when you're reducing the level of tourism that hits these islands on a regular basis, businesses, then you're also affecting other livelihoods that are attached to that, right? So fishing, the food and beverage industry. And if these families cannot access that financial security through savings or be able to afford insurance, then their families begin to struggle again well before a storm comes. And so when a storm comes, you're putting them much more at a disadvantage. So you're increasing those vulnerabilities. You're taking that island Pacific economic vulnerability, and you're now turning that into a major social vulnerability that will take years to recover from. And then another major issue I think we have in the Caribbean is housing and land tenure. No one have papers. Everybody has land that's been passed down through family. And when it comes to like providing paperwork, formal paperwork for ownership for housing, many of our public systems are still paper-based. So you run the risk of losing access to that in a storm. But also what we saw during Dorian is that a lot of the humanitarian organizations, in order for them to touch your house, in order to help you rebuild or gut your house, they needed to see some form of ownership, right? And if your family does not have that, now you're at a disadvantage. You are, first off, you're not probably on the island when all that work is happening because you've been evacuated. Secondly, you don't have access to those documents. So now you need to figure out how you're going to get those documents. And if you lost any sort of other identifying documents in the process, now you have to go through the process of replacing passport, driver's license, birth certificate, that sort of thing. So then we put months and months of trying to get documents on top of each other that delays recovery and delays access to that level of assistance. And we're seeing some of that in Jamaica as well, where people are from those lands, those communities, that's all they know, but they don't have any formal paperwork to show land ownership. And that will definitely help that'll definitely put their ability to get that level of assistance at risk because of that. And then when it comes to cultural and community ties, Yemi mentioned this already. Our family islands, they're not going to move. They're not going to go anywhere. So when you talk about vulnerabilities, these people are going to go back and they're going to rebuild right where they was previously. And so I think our government has did a grave disservice to the people of Abaco and Grand Bahama by allowing them to rebuild without any new sort of restrictions or new sort of guidance on how to build. When you look at some of the communities in Abaco, they should not have been allowed to build the same way. They should have been required to probably build on stilts because of the level of flooding that was seen in that area. So we're not doing any sort of risk assessments or risk applications to islands or communities that are impacted by these storms. And so that in itself is like, I hate when we always use the word of resilience or state of the art or modernized, because these are all fluff terms, right? There's no way a country like the Bahamas can seek resilience if we keep doing the same thing over and over again. And it's interesting to watch Jamaica go through a similar process where they're now having to learn how to recover and how to rebuild, but also they're seeing a lot of their social vulnerabilities come to the forefront. And the answer is not, not what we really do next, but is when it's going to be the next storm. Hurricane season again is right around the corner. Again, this year is going to go pretty fast, and June is going to be here all over again. So what are we doing to help, apply those lessons that we have learned as well as other islands have learned throughout the region?
What are ways that we can ensure preparation and recovery are inclusive?
I'll go. I think, we just discussed a whole bunch of issues and challenges that we encounter right now. And I don't know, the answer is very difficult, Jessica, because there's a couple things that need to be known, I guess. There are a couple disaster response insurance facilities that our government signed on to. And there are also some recovery grants that we get. The thing about those is that they require specific triggers. Some of them, it depends, is it's a whole bunch of different layers, but they require certain triggers to get released to particular governments and agencies, right? And so if you may have a really, let's use in Barbados, we had, who was it that passed? Whichever hurricane passed last year that affected the entire Caribbean, that affected the Eastern Caribbean. A lot of fishermen lost their boats and their livelihoods, right? It was horrible. But the particular insurance facility that they had did not, that particular event did not hit the triggers or the target, so they actually didn't get any of that money, right? So that's something you got to think about. The next thing is that, let's say you do hit the triggers, or you don't have that type of insurance facility that requires triggers. The money might still take, for government specifically, might still take months to years to be released, right? So the government may not see that money a year or 2 years later because of all the bureaucracy and paperwork that they need to go through. I know I'm showing you a bunch of challenges and I haven't actually provided the solution yet, but I just like to, set the picture. Then the next thing is that, okay, let's say these funds are released. If certain vulnerable groups are already at odds or at tension with government or certain social groups, it's likely that they might be last on the list to get that money anyway. So that's another challenge that you have to think about. So what are the solutions? Okay. So, gosh, it's so tough because all solutions require a lot of money from individuals, like a lot of individual people, to have a lot of money, or individual organizations to have a lot of money on hand. So one thing I could say is, if you get funding from a major funder in the future, see if you can ask them to set aside some of the money for disaster response for your own country. So say, hey, thank you for this money. You've given us how much ever amount. Can we set aside 25% for response and recovery so we can target the people who actually need it? The next thing is, if you have very wealthy friends, say the same thing. Like, we need people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is to assist with land tenure that Kendria was talking about, right? I am realizing more and more, unfortunately, that a lot of the ways to take care of ourselves requires having our own agency and a lot of money on hand. I know it sounds difficult, but it seems as though we cannot wait on certain institutions to care about us and take care of us, and we have to find unique and creative ways to take care of ourselves. And that can look like so many different things, but just be creative, be innovative with those whatever measures that you use, and rely on your own networks, right? Like other feminist networks, other LGBTQ networks, private citizens, etc.
Yeah, so I would add, for inclusive preparation and recovery, I think at the basic level, we don't have data. We don't know who in our communities, especially when you're talking about islands that are, like ours, where we have multiple islands, where decisions are, decentralized in one area, and we're making decisions in Nassau for people in Long Island and Mayaguana. And Nassau people don't know who down there. We don't know who on their islands. And the same for, communities in Jamaica and other islands. We don't have data. And from my research, I've realized that the most simplistic data or indicators would tell you a lot about the vulnerabilities and the social dynamics of communities, right? So how many female-headed households do we have in a community? How many households have school-age children? Or how many households have elderly people? Those indicators in itself would tell you how could they be vulnerable, how could they be impacted, what risks they may face, or what level of assistance they may need. We know female-headed households, they may need much more hands on getting their homes repaired, or they may be much more vulnerable in that they live in rented accommodations rather than being able to own accommodations, right? So we know there may be a housing issue there. We also know that they have kids, so their vulnerability is not only taking care of their children from school, health, financial, food, but now they have to care for multiple people on a single income. When you talk about elderly, being able to be mobile, access to medications and healthcare, those sort of things would be automatic understandings if we had that data very early on. And one of the challenges with Dorian, and I worked Dorian day one alongside a number of international groups, including the SEDEMA Emergency Support Function Network, is that we didn't have data. We knew population, and even population data in itself was very old. I mean, in the Bahamas, we did a census in 2022, and it's now 2025, and we're just getting some sort of numbers. And the way the numbers are fitted or packaged, it does not provide data for each specific island, which in itself is another disadvantage. So the way we're collecting data, it just does not make sense to me. And because of that, you can't prepare for a storm. You can't prepare to support vulnerable groups if you don't know who's actually in those communities. Another big thing that I've realized that to make preparedness and response much more equitable, those local communities hold a great value, especially when it comes to leadership. Private sector mobilized much quicker than government, and a lot of international humanitarian aid was channeled through private sector because they don't have bureaucratic processes. They're much more transparent when it comes to finances and how they operate. And so those local leaderships on the ground, whether it be churches, women's group, disability organizations, those groups can definitely advocate for the people that are in those communities because they know it, but they can move much quicker than any government agency can. And so if we really want to talk about being inclusive in that, we must recover from the bottom up. We tend to look from government and look down, but we must look at the local level first and then work our way up to national understanding of who's in our communities.
What have we not yet done or even put into process that would transform our experiences of disasters and our ability to recover?
I can start. You want me to start? Oh man.
Go ahead. Yeah.
What have we not done? The list is so long. From Bahamas perspective, we're still thinking NASA centric. Even though NASA has not been directly hit by a hurricane for some years. Yeah, we're not thinking about family islands. We're not trying to upskill local governments. We're not trying to give them much more authority or much more ability to make decisions for the islands. So that in itself is an issue. We're not thinking about development and how that affects our islands and our sensitive ecosystems. And we see those conversations happening daily. Just specifically with the freight boat that ran aground in Abaco, to learn today that they were fined $20,000 for the level of damage they did to a barrier reef is mind-blowing, because that reef in itself protects wave actions going into the lagoon that affects the community of multiple communities in Abaco. We're not doing a lot. We're not bringing private sector to the table. We're not bringing vulnerable group representatives to the table to have conversations and develop strategies and plans. Our government is still very much so working in some sort of silo, and it doesn't begs good to when it comes to mobilization quickly. Private sector definitely deserves a seat at the table, and I don't think we are really tapping into that resource as much as we need to. And we're not thinking about social protection systems. The reality is the Bahamas have a very low insurance coverage. And at the same time, I remember a few years ago, leading person in the financial sector spoke in regards to that we're not also a saving country. Like many of our people do not have access to savings or even $1,000 in our bank account. So we're not creating local social protection measures that can really help people prepare for disasters or help, create level of safeguards for them. The list of what we're not doing is much longer than it needs to be because the lessons are there. The strategies are there. This is not reinventing the wheel. It's just really implementing things that are actually going to help families and help islands be able to withstand and recover and adapt to any sort of climate related hazard. I'll give it to you, Yemi.
That is absolutely all true. Yeah, the challenge is so huge. It feels, difficult to overcome. This is always a challenge, because you got to find ways to be prepared that is cost effective, is within everybody's means, right? I know Equality Bahamas is doing a lot of work around feminism and LGBTQ inclusion, right? When do you have the capacity to talk about disaster preparedness? Everybody's stretched thin. CSOs are stretched thin. Individual advocates are stretched thin. Most people do this work pro bono, right? So the effort is sometimes so costly, both personally, mentally, and also fiscally. And so that's something that I always like to highlight, that if we had all the time and resources, we can definitely do things because we are all experts in our own way and probably have solutions, I say all that to say, building coalitions across struggle is good. So if all LGBTQ organizations or people or individuals in Bahamas can come together as a coalition, that would be good. And then you can partner with like-minded environmental grassroots organizations. And that collaboration can look like putting pressure on the relevant institutions and decision makers to include you all in disaster preparedness strategy, include you all in constructing national adaptation plans. This is something that comes out of the Paris Agreement. The same thing for something called the Nationally Determined Contribution. Have you all included in those local and somewhat regional frameworks and mechanisms, so that you now know that that there's a particular protection for whatever group you're trying to protect within those official documents. And you can use that potentially to hold certain institutions to account. So that's kind of one thing. The other thing is, we know that the challenge of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters are a lot to do with how certain institutions treat the environment, right? There's always a hotel being built, a mangrove being destroyed, a reef being destroyed. And like I said earlier, everybody's stretched thin, but if we can have good civic engagement, good protesting, people showing up, people making public comments, people being, social disruptors to stop things, nip the issue in the bud, don't even make it happen, right? These are things that we can all employ, so that we can at least protect what little natural environment we have in our relevant islands, because we know that most of the issues we have are a result of, again, environmental degradation caused by our desire to be tourist heavy countries. Another thing I would like to say is also, take inspiration from advocates before us, before our time, and how they operated in secrecy and like real background strategy, you know what I mean, to really make a change. I think we gotta really reinvent the way that we go about advocacy and change, because what we're doing right now is good, but something is not clicking anymore, right? Like, I often think about social movements back then and how effective they were, and what can we do to take inspiration and learn from them, and what can we do in this modern era to be as effective as those social movements back then. And that's something else I've been thinking about. Yeah, I'll stop there.
That's a good one. So be louder and more aggressive. I hear that. We have a couple questions in the chat. Fran has asked, what can we do to get better data? So, Kendria, you brought up we don't have data. Yemi, where did your data come from for this report? What can we do? We don't have it.
Yeah, so data in this country is very funny. So for my PhD, I could not get access to basic social data, and that's gender, that's age, that is annual income. Our data is very outdated, and I think we need to adopt a system that allows us to collect data when people do basic services. And that's basic services like go to a clinic, update their driver's license, update their passport. Those are opportunities to collect some of that basic data so that you have a much more updated understanding of who's in the communities and the type of vulnerable populations that you have in your communities. I think we overcomplicate data for some reason. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why data is also like such a big secret, why we're not publishing data enough. But just from basic demographic information, we can gather a lot of information when it comes to disaster risk management and disaster response strategies. And we can do those through those simple processes that people interface every day, or even much more frequently throughout the year. And it does not have to be overcomplicated. And that would have helped me great for my PhD. But yeah, that would be my immediate suggestion, is finding ways that we can collect very quick data metrics, age, gender, children, vulnerabilities, disabilities, income, those sort of things. And that would provide a world of information for local governments as well as national systems.
I just want to jump in because I'm not finding my raise my hand thing. I don't know what's wrong with me, but anyway, I asked that question because, well, I know someone that was in statistics for a long time, and they just feel with all their might that they're doing everything that they can to collect data. And I'm just wondering, I guess, do we have a feel for like what's wrong with that system? I guess I'm just saying that. Why is it that we have a great minds, I guess, I think they are, but we're not collecting the data that we need? I just feel like every time I'm constantly complaining about not having data, and but it's not changing. It's not getting any better. And I'm just wondering, are they just not automated enough? What is it that they're not doing that we need to advocate for, I guess, is part of it too.
Well, one of the challenges, our data repository is held within government hands. So there's always some level of political influence or political restrictions there. I see that, I mean, every time I see like unemployment numbers, I find that so hilarious, because it's like, how are you measuring unemployment? And what type of unemployment are you measuring? Are you measuring short-term or long-term unemployment? It makes a difference. I think the challenge is our government systems for a very long time did not have to provide data. But I am seeing now, because we are expanding our reach when it comes to developmental loans and climate finance access, that these organizations are requiring access to data. They're requiring, a social specialist on the team. They're requiring an understanding of who the vulnerable groups are, who are the women, are women being targeted, are girls having the same access to, programs and that sort of thing. So gender is a big indicator for a lot of these development organizations. And so we're forcing people to collect data, but again, the data that we're getting from the government side, it's going to be always outdated. Until we have a public entity or advocacy group, like you call it, Bahamas, that is, focused on collecting data from people, or get businesses on board to collect, very basic data metrics, and create that data bank, then we could begin to look at, who is in the communities. But I think if we have to wait for government to do it, it's not going to happen. I think they're going to hold on to any data that they got. And the way they collect data is it's a bit troublesome, because I don't think we should be just surveying, 5 and 6 islands when we have 14 to 21 islands that need to be surveyed. So yeah, that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I'll just pick back off of what you said. On top of that is, I could say from the Barbadian context, some institutions are unwilling to collect specific data. So they're not going to ask people if they're part of the LGBTQ community, which in some ways might be a good thing, because data security and protecting people's privacy is also important. So what can be done, most countries have a statistics or population department or ministry or whatever, and you can write letters and again build coalitions to demand that they collect specific types of data. Another thing though is that, and this is predominantly in the English-speaking Caribbean, is that we have very antiquated access to information laws. So they actually don't have an obligation to share data with the public. They tend to give data to researchers. So you would have to go down to the particular government institution and say, hey, I'm this person with this particular credential and I want this particular type of data. So an advocacy strategy could be advocating for modernization of the access to information at our law. That's something that you all can do. And again, do it through coalitions. The more voices, the better. So not just Equality Bahamas, but everybody else. Another thing that you can do, and this speaks to the report that I got, what my organization does is that we contact local universities for whatever topic we're trying to do something on. And let's say it's law related, whatever. When you collect data as a organization is not credited or considered credible, they may not trust the data, right? But if you collaborate with an academic institution to say, hey, Sorry. Y'all get paid, especially those like tenured professors, y'all get paid such and such and such a year to do this. This is your job. I have this idea. Can y'all come and collect this data for me? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you can do that. The other thing is UN agencies. Again, y'all have this very wonderful salary. Y'all want help, come and slap your name onto this particular project and collect the data. And then that makes your data credible. And I like to, again, I always want to urge people to be like creative and innovative. Know what your capacity is, and then say, let me just lean on this institution with the money, the funding, and the capacity, right? So you can collect credible data that way. So piggybacking on what Kendria said, which is we don't have audits of our specific communities. Who lives where? What is a challenge? Do they have a disability? What's the income? This is all data that Equality Bahamas can collect with collaboration with whatever university there is out there, or PhD student, or UN agency, or I don't know. I'm trying to think about somebody else that might be, I don't know, maybe insurance company. They need that. Can we give you, and what can you give us, essentially?
But those private sector partners is important. Insurance is very much so interested in climate risk now. So them having access to data benefits them. And I do remember they were complaining about access to data as well. But when you talk about phone companies, water companies, they also need access to that level of data. So finding a network where, if I'm going to pay my water bill, it pops up like, oh, update your profile. And you just tell me how much people are in your households. What is your annual income? What is your gender? And just with a click, they get access to that data. That data is available that can be used in multiple aspects throughout the community. And it's not only disaster related. I don't know how we're making policies, and we don't know who we're making policies for, but that's probably a different webinar.
I just want to say one thing on that, if I may. Yeah, and it all comes back to government though, because you talk about the water company, and it then comes back to advocacy to change the law, because they really have no reason to rush with the data. So we need to change the law that they need to share the information, and then that way we could put more pressure on them. But until then, I don't see it changing. And as far as the cost of getting the data, they already have the systems in place. It's just a matter of them collecting it. But if they have no impetus, then, it's just not been happening.
Well, that's why creating a network where you could collect data. So, for example, let's take the US voting system. When they go for elections, they're collecting all of that demographic data, but they're also asking other, important national questions all at the same time. Like, do you think we should smoke in public? Yes or no? People are making those type of decisions. We're not taking advantage of the access to people that we currently have. And if you have a system where if someone is going to go pay their water bill, that data can be collected electronically, and probably at very minimal cost than what they're doing now with the census data. Yeah, we have to think more modernized, and collecting electronic data is much more accessible. Everybody has a phone in their hand. They may not always have data all the time, but everybody has access to some sort of electrical device. And if you give them access where they have to fill out a survey that is literally 5 questions, and that is then sent through some sort of database, then you've got your data. It does not need to be overcomplicated. And I think that's the problem. We overcomplicate. We don't want to modernize, because once we start modernize the public system, then you're pushing a certain demographic of people out. And so everything has to be paper-based. And because it's paper-based, we wait 3 years for census data. And now that census data is invalid because it's already old. Yeah.
Fran, you had answered some questions early on in the chat. I'll try to answer them quickly. What's the difference between preparedness and mitigation? Mitigation is just making sure that your infrastructures and whatever measures you have in place are as airtight as possible. So if you have a building that doesn't have hurricane straps, you put the hurricane straps on that to mitigate to when the natural hazard comes, the disaster comes, the house don't get blown down, or it might get touched a little bit, but this time you lost a roof, essentially, right? So you're just patching up your infrastructure. That's mitigation. Preparedness deals with what actual actions you're going to take. So somebody's house the roof get blow off because the mitigation wasn't that great. But now, how are you going to actually take care of that person's home? Like, what plans and measures do you have in place to go and take care of that person's home? I hope I answered that properly. So yeah, I try to break it down as simply as I could, but it's just.
I like to tell people
Don't sound like the same thing.
I tell people mitigation.
Sorry.
When you think about mitigation, think long term, right? So, and think systems. So, mitigation is like installing renewable energy, improving the energy system, improving the water system. But at a household level, mitigation is like hurricane proof windows. It is investing in insurance or building on stilts, building higher ground. And preparedness is more so how direct impacts from that actual hazard, whether it be flooding, a hurricane, I don't know, a snowstorm, whatever it is. How are you going to prepare for that actual hazard? So how are you going to prepare for floods? What preparedness are you going to do specifically for that? And that may be like raising all your things off the ground, that sort of thing. So that's how I like to differentiate mitigation versus preparedness. Mitigation is long-term, and preparedness is directly related to that specific hazard.
Thank you for that. That leads to Fran's next question. Yemi's out here doing my job. What are the things that we should be looking at as part of long-term recovery?
I don't even know if I have a solid answer for this, because I guess the thing about recovery and response, everything is so unique, so different. Every is contextual, right? It's contextual, and everything builds into each other, like falls into each other. So based on what data you have collected and based on the level of destruction, you then pivot and respond accordingly. That is a very vague answer, Fran, but that's really what I can say now. I feel Kendria might have a better response than I do.
Long-term recovery. I think to best frame that is, for us, we have to stop looking at recovery, or we have to stop looking at hurricane season as just 6 months out of the year, because a single hurricane, like we saw with Dorian, and now that we're seeing with Melissa, a single hurricane can take households up to 5 and 6 years to recover from. And within that, there's opportunities for compounding hurricane or compounding floods that happen in the process. So you're building vulnerabilities on vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities, and you're not giving people time to breathe. And I think the moment you stop thinking about recovery as a quick process and start thinking about it long term, and stop thinking about hurricane season as 6 months and think about it as 12 months, then you get to make better decisions and better choices, especially when it comes to programming and access to assistance. For us, people thought Dorian, they're gonna run a program for 6 months and then we're gonna see how it goes. It took 6 months to get access to some of those programs or to get any level of assistance. And I think that is the problem. We always think short term because in our regional eyes, recovery is really based on tourism. We use those metrics as a form to say, oh, we're back to 2019 levels, or we're back to pre-COVID levels. And that's not what recovery is. Recovery is basically at the basic household community level. These families, these households are able to function in a way where they can maintain access to affordable healthcare, food, electricity, water, those sort of things. And so, yeah, we don't think about recovery in the right way. We think about it from an economic, macroeconomic standpoint. And because of that, we've put timelines on recovery that is simply unrealistic for our communities.
So if I could expand then, so I guess, so we're saying, I'm saying that recovery takes longer than 6 months, whatever number that we're saying. And I'm just saying, what type things should be in place then to help people recover? What should recovery look like? I mean, I don't even understand what we're saying as far as, yeah.
Yeah, so we've been talking about vulnerable groups all night. So the best way to recovery is understanding who those people are in your community. So, for example, if we have female-headed households, right? Recovery for a mother with two children or one children could mean she may need access to uniform, she may need access to school financial assistance, she may need access to food assistance, and that in itself, it should not have a short timeline attached to it. As long as she's in need, she should be able to get access to assistance. Obviously, our social protection or social assistance is really built to provide you assistance to get you a point where you can get off of it. And we don't do that. We just provide the minimal level of assistance. And that in itself is not enough to help support the people that are on those social programs. If you're talking about people with disabilities, that may be, helping rebuild their homes, increasing access to certain, services that they don't have access to, taking services to them rather than them having to get out to go on a bus or catch a ride to get services. So recovery differs very much so based on the vulnerabilities of that person or the groups that are within that community. And we don't do that. For us, recovery is let's get light and water on, which is understandable, but let's get tourist dollars on the ground, which from an economic standpoint, makes sense. You want to get money flowing through the community, but we don't think about recovery from the actual vulnerable group standpoint.
Can I jump in here, Fran? Because I like your question and I like your responses, Kendria. Yeah, Fran, I think you're trying to look for like concrete, tangible ways that we can do long-term recovery. And I guess we could use Haiti as an example. The 2008 earthquake, there's some people who are still recovering from that, right? And since that earthquake, they've had other hurricanes. And so they're recovering from the earthquake and then the hurricanes. And then there's social unrest. So there's all these different things that they're recovering from because disaster takes on many forms. It's not just environmental. And so long-term recovery, I guess, tangibly could look like, within Equality Bahamas or even the Bahamas, the government, et cetera, is actually talking about long-term recovery. They say, hey, in your disaster preparedness policies and plans, do you have things in place for recovering for a particular disaster a year down the line, two years down the line, 5 years, ask specifically for those timelines, advocate for those timelines specifically, say, hey, actually, we want you to expand your recovery timeline, whatever that might be. And then you can even say things like, we actually want to hit these particular indicators, right? So you can use a very small island in the Bahamas to say, we want within 2 years that 75% of the community is back to normal, right? So that's one thing that I can think about tangibly, Fran. And another thing that I also like to say is we have to think about the recovery, but I don't even getting that far. I think we give people leeway because it's you anticipate something bad. Let me word this properly. By saying that we anticipate disaster, we sometimes don't hold the relevant institutions to account, right? So what are the issues that humans face? We have, again, that hierarchy of needs, right? Which is food, shelter, housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Disaster occurs when these needs are not met in the first place. You know what I'm saying? So we should be advocating for the improvement of the lives of people also, right? First and foremost. Tackle that. Then we can tackle the thing down the line. Because a lot of people, if they had the means to, would not be as devastated by these issues. You get what I'm saying? As Kendria was saying earlier, we have building codes, have some level of, I don't want to say enforcement because the onus is also on the government, but if we know that a particular structure cannot withstand a certain level, a Cat 5, for example, then that should be included in the building code, and then the government should provide the materials for that particular structure. So this is what I mean. There's, of course, a recovery, but do the work before, and that's what I'll say. Yeah.
Some mitigation.
Yes.
Earlier, when we were talking about, you know what, Alicia's hand is up. You have the floor.
You don't want to go first?
No.
Okay.
Go on.
Okay. Lots of things going on in here. I'm thinking about recovery and I'm wondering if you see a way of thinking about it and treating it as a form of preparedness because we know the next event is coming. And I'm thinking about the way recovery is often done because there's this much damage and the idea, right? What they tell us is there's this much money. And so it's a lot of quick fixes. Let's just patch the road. Let's not actually like rebuild it. Let's clean the drains. Let's not acknowledge that the drains actually are not working for various reasons because of, I don't know, sea level where we are, whatever, like drains just aren't the solution for us. How do we move from the sort of emergency mode of just meeting the needs right away and the quick fixes to developing long-term solutions so that we are building differently, so that we're addressing these long-term issues like the flood zones, like people whose houses will flood every single time there's hard rain, not hurricane, hard rain, 15 minutes, you can't step out into your yard. How do we solve that? Thinking about recovery in terms of what it looks like when society is functioning properly. Are people housed? Is everyone eating nutritious food? Are all the children in school? Are the people who want to work and are able to work employed? Are people mentally well? You know, like we maybe need sort of these markers, right, that go beyond, oh, well, I drove through the neighborhood and I didn't see any more blue tarps. Okay. But they might have put the same shitty kind of roof on there that isn't going to last the next storm. So I'm thinking about or wanting you maybe to comment on this connection between recovery and preparedness and how we can not just get over something, but prepare for the next thing so that we're not in the same situation again. And I want to say something about data, but I want you to comment on that first.
Well, that is the whole point of resilience, right? The concept of resilience is taking those lessons learned or taking those vulnerabilities, their inequalities, and addressing them so you can get better for the next one. After Dorian, they had like this slogan, build back better. And that's a big slogan in the disaster risk management space, right? But you're not building back better if you're not applying urban risk assessments, if you're not looking at how people are rebuilding, or you're not providing guidance on what people should be doing different. So yeah, we're so focused on the Band-Aid that we're not looking at the issues, and they know the issues. Contractors especially know the issues. It's just that it is not a priority for government because government works on a 5-year cycle. And if they took their time to recover properly and really implement some of the strategies or policies or programs that need to be implemented, it's going to take them longer than 5 years. So government always goes for the quick win, right? What can we put in the newspaper? What photo op can we do? Let's put on a hard hat and dig up some sand for groundbreaking. This is what they do. They're never going to be concerned of long-term resilience because they're always so politically focused on 5-year wins. And in reality, I have to blame the people because we get very excited when we see, groundbreaking news happening and totally forget that, that little piece of woods your MP gave you last year can be washed away this year from a different storm. Like we don't think long term, we think short term. And because of that, government has taken advantage of that. But that is the basis of resilience. It is looking at those challenges and damage and impacts and figuring out how can you strengthen those existing systems so that those impacts are minimized the next time around. And yeah, we're just not doing it. It takes money, it takes political will, and it takes time. And nobody wants to spend that amount of time. And, doing what's right is not politically attractive.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of what you said. And respond to Alicia or Alicia. Which one? Okay. First one, Alicia. Okay, great.
Alicia.
Yeah, awesome. I think you kind of answered your question in your question when you were talking about, getting back to the basic needs that people need, are kids in school, are people fed, are people housed, and what have you. So what you can do, I guess, as an organization and as a potential coalition of other organizations, that's what I'm actually hoping that you all do after this call. Like really think about who's out there doing the particular work that you do, and then how that intersects with environmental work, et cetera, et cetera. But you have access to your communities. In this particular conversation, we're talking about LGBTQ individuals and women, right? And I'm not sure how far Equality Bahamas stretches, but I'm assuming you are in touch with various communities. So what you can do is an audit of these particular communities, which is what level are they at right now, right? What level of inequalities exist? How many people are housed, unhoused, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that community's baseline. We know what it is, right? And then you can, before we get to the disaster, whatever, you can figure out ways as a community to improve the lives of those individuals. I can use an example of land tenure that Kendria brought up, right? If there's a disaster, we need to know that the people who live there own the rights to the land, et cetera, et cetera. So we have that baseline audit. We have an idea of what the I guess how a disaster can impact that particular community, right? Cool. So a disaster happens and people are struggling now. Because you have that baseline audit, now you have evidence to suggest what proper recovery can look like. And that can be done, as a community. You can do crowdsourcing. Again, have your friends who have money open their pockets. And then you can also go to private institutions and governments to say, hey, this is our baseline. We have this data. We did this audit in whatever every year, and we actually want this community to get back to that baseline or even improve it, because we believe that if we had these particular social safety nets, this disaster would have looked a lot differently. Alicia, I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, and it makes me think of something I was thinking about earlier around data as well. Like the fact that NGOs are already, not all NGOs, some NGOs are connected to communities. And it means that we have access to data, right? And that data isn't just numbers, it's also stories, it's also narratives, it's also the things that we know to be true based on the people that we're interacting with, the kinds of things that they're asking about, the kinds of conflict that people are facing. So I've also been thinking about, and I haven't really formed the question yet, but thinking about the ways that we tend to rely on the government, and we should be able to rely on the government. Like the government has certain jobs also, but however, they suck. And there are other places to get this data. There are other ways to find out who is in XYZ neighborhood, who is elderly, and who won't be able to just evacuate themselves, right? Who's going to need some extra assistance? Who are the people with disabilities that need certain kinds of vehicles to come to get them because they also need to take their mobility devices with them? This isn't information that the government necessarily has. I don't know that the census collects it, but NGOs that are working with these people, the food banks that are making deliveries to them have that information. So it seems like there might be a mapping exercise that needs to happen. One of the challenges, though, is that NGOs and all of these different bodies, the churches, whoever are doing this work, don't necessarily work together and also don't trust each other. And a thing that I experienced running the hurricane relief after Hurricane Dorian was that people had put a lot of trust in me, and I felt a lot of responsibility for protecting that data. So when people came around asking questions, I was like, I can't help you because these people didn't give me their information for me to just give it to you, XYZINGO. So there are a lot of trust issues that we have to work through before we can actually collaborate and be able to develop like the rich data, the map that can exist and that we need.
Yeah, I can jump right in here real quick. And that is true. That is right. And I sometimes understand the distrust of each other because, I get it. I get it. What you can do from a legal standpoint, so if you have any lawyers in your network, is with these organizations, have a meeting, have a sit down and talk, right? About, what's going on in the Bahamas as it pertains to disasters, et cetera, et cetera. Have a conversation and say, again, we want to build this coalition, we want to collaborate, but we understand this distrust. This is where the lawyer comes in. You create a memorandum of understanding. This is the data that we plan to share. Yada, like kind of develop a structure among each other on how you can share data, how that data can be used, so that this is me being a wishful thinker. I know that collaboration is not as easy as having a conversation and sit down, whatever. But I feel like if you add some, hey, this is how we're gonna have a legally binding agreement among each other, through a memorandum of understanding or whatever legal document you all come up with, that can help ease the tension, hopefully. But then that should also be coupled with, okay, so we're sharing this data. Now, how do we have coordinated responses to the particular disaster? Because you don't want to do have work being done twice, or you don't want to give maybe an organization responsibility for a particular group, but then they discriminate against a group or whatever. But the truth is, and I think I keep saying this all the time, and this is me being hopeful for future collaborations, among different Caribbean islands and even in Barbados organizations within Barbados and what have you, is that we can't do it as individuals. We can't do it as individual organizations. It's actually impossible, and we actually need to coordinate and collaborate among each other. And that doesn't mean collaborate with people that you don't like, but at least let it be more than one organization leading the charge, because you honestly cannot do it alone. Yeah,
that is the challenge. You cannot do it alone, and there are so few people doing advocacy in the Bahamas. It's just, I'm defeated.
I guess
because sorry, Yemi. Because I think one of the greatest things about the Bahamas is that private sector civic society network, and no government is going to be able to respond to any hurricane without that network. But that network has a great deal of trust within the communities. And that is where I think it should start with data collection. And I was having a conversation today with some friends in Jamaica who are working on recovery. And they're realizing they don't have that strong NGO, local level, community-based presence that the Bahamas had. And because of that, they're lagging behind on where they want to be in recovery. So I think Bahamas has a great opportunity, especially when it comes to data collection and having much more directed response to vulnerable groups. And that will come through those private sector civic society groups.
Sorry, Fran, you had asked a question in the chat, and I'm going to ask the question back to you, so I'm making sure I'm answering the right question. You are asking what advocacy should be done to halt certain forms of development that is economically viable to the country. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, actually, what I was asking is, so we should be, it was said, I can't remember, I think it might have been, I can't remember who said it, but we were saying that we need to be speaking up whenever the hotels, you said that, I think, speaking up whenever the hotels were being built, and we should be out there shouting. And I guess what I was saying is that nobody is listening. If tourist dollars are coming in, it's sort of like you can go in there and shout till you fall over and back your head, but we're putting this whole up because we're going to be able to hire more people and more money coming into the country. So I'm just saying that, and Kendria, I'm pronouncing the names wrong. Kendria was answering me. She started to say that, yes, it was shown somewhere that the cruise ships are not viable, that, and I don't know exactly why, but having that information available, and that's exactly what I'm saying. We need to know what are the strong arguments that we should have on our placards when we go out there and start screaming that, listen, this is why you can't do this. And so that we can get enough people behind us also shouting. But, like, we need to know what they are, because otherwise almighty dollar is going to win at the end of the day.
Yeah, money talks, So I can't even, I'm trying to find an example where people rose up and stopped development, but even in Barbados, I'm having a hard time thinking about it. Recently, in a place called Whole Town, a decision was made to destroy what citizens consider a historical site, and there was a big rallying call, like probably some of the best, one of the best examples of civic engagement in Barbados in recent history. But that site is still being built, right? So I guess, speaking of what you're saying, Fran, like we see people rise up and nothing is done or nothing changes. I guess my answer to this question is, I guess you got to continue doing it, and you got to figure out a way to shame decision makers and developers, and also use, I guess, the tourist dollar against them. Like, to be honest, most tourists, well, not most, some tourists really don't care to be in a resort and have certain natural infrastructure destroyed. So if you can find a way to have, Bahamas that live in Bahamas, maybe diaspora Bahamas, are even tourists that consistently come to Bahamas, say, actually, we don't want another hotel. You're ruining this beach that I like. You know what I mean? That's, I guess, one way. Another thing is legal loopholes. You know what I mean? If you can halt development in any way that you can, using the law against them, that's something that you can do. Sometimes, they give the information that you need to utilize legal loopholes. I understand that might require money to a particular lawyer to do such and such and such, but sometimes using the law in an inventive way against the person is sometimes a good measure. And then another thing is that I know that we can become jaded, but if we consistently do civic engagement, some forms of civic disobedience where possible, it's you doing it, but then there's also a younger generation seeing you doing it, and that could become a social norm where it could be a Bahamas in the future where younger people do take power and they're like, actually, we don't really rock with this thing, you know what I mean? Like, so you can shift social norms through I am losing words right now, but do it.
You said a good example, and hopefully we'll start something going that'll grow. Yeah.
So don't.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. So just keep doing it. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. Somebody will see at some point. Yeah.
You mentioned beaches and, people being vocal about not wanting them destroyed. Alicia asked, have you guys in Barbados been able to keep beaches private?
So yes, we have. Yes, we have. But this is where the legal loopholes that I tell you.
Public.
Public. Yeah. Yes. We're on the same page. Yes, the beaches are public, right? But a couple seconds ago, I was talking about use the legal loopholes against them. Yeah, them is use the legal loopholes against we. So the beaches are indeed public. But if you have a massive amount of money and you build your property in such a way that it makes it uncomfortable for the public to access it, some people, hotels, individuals, etc., do have private beaches. They find a way to circumvent the law. You know what I mean? But for the most part, if I roll up on somebody's quote unquote private property and bid on their beach, they can't tell me nothing. But getting there might be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, we have the same problem here. Going back a bit, we talked about mandatory evacuations and how some people don't want to or can't evacuate. What can be done in those situations?
I don't think there's much that could be done in those situations. I know in law we have instituted mandatory evacuations, and they simply tell you if you don't want to evacuate, write your name and information on your arm. But I think this is where strengthening local shelters, and if we have to do it through multi-purpose buildings like schools, that is fine. But making sure that shelters are built with the goal of being a shelter, then you can begin to minimize the need to have mass evacuations, or at least evacuations specifically from the island. Yeah, Dorian is our new norm. And the quicker we actually accept that, the much better we would be at developing a plan that actually works for each island. And that plan cannot just come from NASA. That's the problem. The plan has to make sense for the people that actually live on those islands. So another thing is when we're evacuating, we don't always have to evacuate to Nassau. The island is breaking up, the country is breaking up in regions. So maybe we evacuate to a different region, and it doesn't always have to be Nassau. So it's thinking about evacuation in a different way. And the same for the Caribbean, Eastern Caribbean. Those islands are fairly close to each other. So evacuation for them may be evacuating to another country. So yeah, it's finding also regional responses to evacuation needs, because I think evacuation is going to be much more common for the region than we would like to admit. And in many ways, it'll be much safer for a number of our islands that if we just get people off of it, then we can, go back and address the damage that is done structurally. So yeah, that's my input. That's my 5 cents.
I don't have a response. I don't know. I make a joke about this, which is because I guess if you have to evacuate, you have to evacuate. But personally, I will be going and disrupting whatever colonizer country I need to go to. So if I evacuate and I go into England and causing a disturbance, you know what I mean? That's my 2 cents on that.
Why not? Okay, well, thank you both for your coins. Does anyone else have any questions? Please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Or Alicia, any lingering questions?
I have a question on that note of going to England and disrupting the vibe. There's a lot of talk about climate financing, not as much talk about reparations. So thinking about climate justice and the cause of the climate crisis that we're experiencing and where that's coming from and where the money should be coming from, alongside the under-resourcing of NGOs that are doing the bulk of the work, right? That end up stepping up to do the work. And it seems like all the plans for climate financing is for that money to go to governments and not to NGOs. Thoughts?
Gosh, not just governments, by the way, private institutions also. It's the climate finance conversation is one that I am not too au fait with. Like I try, but then I think it's purposely convoluted and complicated. And what I'm learning when I go to these developmental spaces, whether it be a COP or what have you, there's these conversations happening at this level, and then above our heads is conversations about money, right? And Fran was very clear to say that money talks, and it talks at those levels also. So climate finance, climate reparations in general, sorry. This is, I'm trying to figure out how to answer this question. One thing is that I'm noticing is that we're getting further and further away in terms of time from, colonization. We're still colonizing in a sense, but the abolition of slavery, right? And I wonder if they're using that time so that the cases that we have to access reparations becomes weaker and weaker as time goes by, right? They can be like, oh, well, that was 600 years ago now, so really and truly, there's nothing we can offer. Black families have so much offspring that we can't necessarily, track who owes who what and what have you. I think that's something that's being done, might be on purpose. What I can say though is that there is a strong case to support that transatlantic slavery did cause the current climate and environmental issues that we're having right now. In the context of Barbados, sugarcane plantations were on every square kilometer of this island, and it depleted our island's soil's fortitude. And to this day, we're still recovering from that in terms of our agricultural sector and food security is on rocky grounds because of that, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is if we do get access to that money or funds, who does it go to? In Barbados, a guy named Hilary Beckles was able to make a case that I cannot remember which institution. It was a Christian institution, though, that they took part in slavery, but he got, and I don't have a firm opinion on this, but that money went to UE to fund their research on diseases. What do you call them? The ones that are like diabetes, et cetera, et cetera.
Non-communicable.
Anyway, thank you for that. Anyway, I know I'm rambling right now, Alicia, and I apologize for that. The thing is that this conversation is so complicated and convoluted that I worry that even if we do get access to funds, it may not come in the way that we want. I support the research on non-communicable diseases, but that really didn't touch the hands of people who were directly impacted by that particular institution, right? Like you drive around the island of Barbados, you can see a massive plantation house and some sugarcane fields and like actual houses near that, and you know for a fact that they're the direct descendants of the slaves who worked that land. They did not see that money. You understand what I'm saying? And so that's the complicated bit. In terms of climate finance now, okay. One, in Azerbaijan, the amount of money that a lot of global South countries advocated for, I think it was upwards of something like some $1 trillion or whatever. They agreed, and I don't have the exact numbers, so you all might need to go ahead and fact check me, but it was, let's say it was $1 trillion. They only released about, was it 200 million or something, nowhere close to the amount of money needed to develop climate resilience and response, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's one thing. Let's say we did get this money. Who does it go to? Who has the authority to distribute to the people that need it, right? I don't want to be like negative or anything, but if we are operating on systems that already do not care about the most vulnerable, getting money, thank you very much, Alicia, getting money is not necessarily going to solve the issues if those systems already exist. If you get what I'm saying? Yeah. And that was a convoluted way to answer your question, I think, but I just want to keep those things in mind when we talk about these.
Just to jump in here, though, I mean, we had a little bit of a conversation about reparation, and apparently who the money goes to is a part of the conversation, the pre-conversation, and deciding what you're going to ask for. So all of that is being considered as a part of it, and rightfully so, because I mean, I always say here is that it's all fine and dandy to increase taxes or to get more money, but we have a big black hole. And so what's the point in getting more money? Because it's just being sucked down the black hole. It's not solving any of the problems.
Right. Thank you, Fran. And again, who is allowed into the rooms that decide where the money goes? You know what I'm saying? If some people are historically barred from those conversations, it might not be race related now, but it might be class related. If upper class Black families, people of African descent, are in the rooms, they might not be able to speak on the plight of people below that class. So the conversation still goes back to the same thing. If the systems and the barriers exist, who's getting that money? I'm going to stop talking on this. I don't know if Kendria has something.
No, I just wanted to add on the climate finance point. Alicia, I totally get your point. Climate finance is typically directed towards governments, and in many cases, it's in the form of loans. And the parts that are directed towards grants are not very much so for community level programming. There may be some capital project like a solar installation. And so, yeah, the question is that type of finance actually addressing the climate mitigation and adaptation needs of the country? And more likely it's not. And another thing is with climate finance systems that currently exist, there's no level of accountability for government. So even if, we access $5 million for, I don't know, marine ecosystems and national parks and, counting seagrass, if the project is not done, there's no government is being held accountable for not doing it, because now it's just a loan. Now we have to pay it back, or we just lose access to that finance because it's not completed. So yeah, it's a devilish circle, because in reality, a lot of community-based organizations should be getting access to it, and then you would begin to see that lovely word resilience trickle throughout the community. But I think what is definitely missing from the region is a united civic society body that can advocate for climate finance at that level. So when you look at COP, you don't see much civic society or NGO bodies at the forefront. It's all governmental. And I think we're missing an opportunity to introduce our third, I want to say, government system. I consider civic society and private sector a third government system. We're missing an opportunity to really put them on the international stage when it comes to climate change and climate-related matters.
You just said something so brilliant, Kendria, and I want to piggyback off of that. I want to say two things, and it's on the climate finance topic. You also have to consider where the money is coming from. The money is coming from private institutions, private corporations, like large corporations. That might be oil, that might be banking, et cetera, et cetera. So in these climate finance conversations, and I've been invited to a few, they called it, climate finance, but the bulk of the conversation was finance. And at this particular engagement were various international banks, and what they were talking about as it pertains to the Caribbean was the fact that because our governments are so disjointed, it makes it difficult for these corporations to come and conduct business in our region, because it doesn't make sense having a headquarters, let's say in Barbados, but there's all these different financial barriers making Barbados and let's say Bahamas communicate with each other. So they were more so concerned with the bureaucratic tape that they have to go through if they set up shop here, right? And our government institutions were like, but actually we want you here, and by allowing you here, we hope that you will release some of the money to go into these climate finance conversations, right? This is the type of conversations that are happening above our head, and that's the most simple way I could discuss it. All that to say, climate is not at the forefront of the climate finance conversation, and certainly the plight of marginalized and vulnerable groups. That's something that I want everybody to be very, very clear of. Now, speaking to piggybacking off what Kendria said about civic society presence at COPs. Okay, so because COP is a whole other situation. A lot of deals are made at COP, right? A lot of oil deals are made at COP. It's one of the from a corporation perspective is an easy place to go and meet people and shake hands and make deals, right? Something else that's happening at COP is something called negotiations. There's these negotiation rooms. They pick certain parts of the climate conversation that are discussed, right? That might be, women and gender, migration, climate finance, loss and damage. These are the particular topics in these negotiation rooms, and that looks like states, representatives from the state, going to talk about the words and the language that is going to be on a particular document that they come up with, for like whatever outcome document comes out of these conversations. Okay, and there are some civil society representatives that get access to those rooms by way of being sometimes labeled as civil society, but maybe through their government, right? So I'm setting the stage for you all. How can civil society be engaged in those conversations? It can happen at a country level. So in the Bahamas, in Barbados, go to the Ministry of Environment, go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, go to even some of the embassies. There's some countries in these negotiation rooms that might be more human rights centered. So you, as an individual, can say, hey, can I talk to this particular state representative so that you can include this language in the negotiations, essentially, right? That's what it can look like. Just going to whoever is representing the country at whatever conference of the parties or whatever, and say, this is the type of language I want you to advocate for. The challenge is now, right? Okay, is that there are countries who are obviously against these things for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason. So you might enter the room, the negotiation might start with a very beautiful, robust document that speaks to the advancement of women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. And then some countries can knock that document down to 5 lines that don't speak about anything we're talking about, right? So it's a long, convoluted process. And at the end of the day, money talks. But it shouldn't discourage you all from being involved if you can, right? Because not many people are aware of the processes and how they work. And so the more people engage, I guess, the more the change is possible. Yeah.
Same stuff, different day.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to come in with a question or a comment on what was just shared before I ask my final question? If you do think of something, please put it in the chat. The last question was asked privately to me by my little sister, who, as I'm telling everyone who will give me an ear, has been recently called to the Bahamas bar. Yemi, you mentioned one way earlier, which I did write down, but are there other ways that lawyers can help in all this? Even
Great. All countries have public comment mechanisms, and that looks different from island to island, of course. So that might be a law reform commission or committee, that might be an ombudsman, that might be a private sector reform committee, it might be a fair trading commission. There's different labels for these things in different countries, but they absolutely have to have the public engage in those mechanisms. So that's one thing. However, the way to be engaged is convoluted, and the layman may not necessarily understand how to go about that, what to do or whatever. This is where lawyers come in. Lawyers have access to this information, or can gain access to this information, and say, okay, in 6 months, there's going to be a opportunity for the public to comment on this particular decision, whatever that might be. That might be a town and country planning, whatever it might be. You can utilize a lawyer to help you construct a legally sound public comment and organize not just one organization or individual, but have mass submissions, so that it ends up on the radar of whoever the decision makers are. So that's one thing. Then your sister should also know about national determined contributions and national adaptation plans. These are frameworks outside of the Paris Agreement. And then the next thing is, above that would be, let's say y'all bring a case, a civil case or whatever that might be, and something, your sister might know the better language than I do, but something, maybe the Bahamas isn't, something happens where it fails, right? There's the CCJ, Caribbean Court Justice, you know what I mean? So there's also mechanisms so there's things that might not necessarily pass locally, but then it may go to the CCJ, right? There's that. Then there is UN frameworks and treaties. There's something called the Universal Periodic Review, which is something that all countries that sign on to whatever treaty must do. They get away with saying they've done good work because civil society isn't usually engaged in that. Your sister as a lawyer might be able to, go through this language and figure out exactly how civil society and individuals can partake in these particular mechanisms that already exist. then you can use that to hold your government to account or a private actor, depends on the framework, the individual, the institution, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Kendria, any response to that?
No, I think she's correct. I think the legal system is a great way to hold governments accountable, especially when it comes to existing legislation and policies and agreements. One thing that I've noticed here, we like to go travel to the big meetings and talk about climate change, and we need climate finance, and then you get access to the climate finance and hire 1 million consultants, and then at the same time you approve the development to destroy the coral reefs, and we only fine the people $20,000. So this is a great opportunity for lawyers to take governments to court and to hold them accountable. But I think there's a bigger picture here. I think our governments don't do what is right until they're embarrassed. So through the court system is also a great way to make a lot of these decisions or these activities internationally known. And that way you get that international attention, and then you get them to act right. So if we have to use the legal system, I'm all for it. Because like Fran said earlier, you can make noise all you want, but they're not going to do anything different until they basically feel embarrassed or feel like their back is against the wall.
Thank you both for that. Yemi, I typed as fast as I could, and I do plan to put her to work. And Kendria, it's very sad that sometimes people have to be embarrassed into doing the right thing. Alicia, would you like to do your little pre-closing remark?
Yes. First of all, thank you to Kendria and Yemi for being here with us. I know Jessica will give you a more fulsome thank you, but really appreciate you coming for this conversation. We're very happy that we were able to integrate climate and people in situations of vulnerability into the global 16 days of activism that centers women. And of course, we center LGBTQI plus people always. We have more events coming up. You know, we go hard during 16 days. We have like 12 events all the time every year. So the next one is tomorrow, Thursday, December 4th. We are screening Tiny Movements, which is a documentary about my friend Jen Green, who experienced marital rape. So she is sharing her story with us and the way that she has been charting her own path to healing by going back to her practice of dance, because she's a professionally trained dancer, and also seeking justice through shitty court systems. It's a short documentary. It's less than 30 minutes. And then we'll have lots of time to talk with her, as well as Laura Sweeney, who directed the documentary. So that's Thursday, December 4th at 6 p.m. virtual. On Saturday, we have 3 events. One is in person. So we're starting at Poinciana Paper Press at 9:30 for a workshop on erasure poetry, also known as blackout poetry, which is pretty cool. Poet, not a poet, come in, join us, and start with a page that isn't blank. We're going to start with some other piece of text and then kind of get rid of words and phrases to leave words that create our own poem. And then we have a conversation at 12 about reclaiming the workplace, which I think is going to be really interesting. I'm really excited about it. Talking to employers, to leaders in the workplace about the ways that they are creating feminist workspaces and how they're kind of turning things on their head and making sure that workers are treated like people and have their needs met, even if they have to be a part of the capitalist machine for now until the revolution. And then at 2, we have a conversation about reclaiming faith. We'll be talking to faith leaders about challenging fundamentalisms, and in particular Christian fundamentalisms, very important for us in the Bahamas. Sunday, we're back at Poinciana Paper Press for reclaiming textiles. And for this, you have to do a little bit of preparation. It's in person. It's from noon to 4 p.m., but you can drop in at any time in that period. I mean, don't come at 3:45. Come between 12 and 3, because the process takes some time. Bring an article of clothing that you don't want to wear anymore and probably don't want to keep anymore, something you want to reclaim. So it could be a dress you wore when you were assaulted. It could be the socks you had on when you found out so-and-so died, like whatever. Bring something that holds a memory that you don't really want, that you want to turn into something else. And we are going to cut it up into little tiny pieces and do some other things to turn it into paper. Then on Tuesday, that's December 9th, we have a conversation with Dr. Indira Martin, who is the head of the National Reference Lab, a biomedical scientist. Is that the right? I think that's the right term. She's super smart, basically. And she is going to come and talk to us about reclaiming our health, the connection between the brain and the gut. She's going to talk about epigenetics. So some of the trauma that happens to our bodies through our genes and it gets passed on from generation to generation as a result of trauma that's experienced, including the transatlantic trade in people who were enslaved. We end 16 Days of Activism with a conversation with Gaynell Curry. That's going to be at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas on West Hill Street, Wednesday, December 10th, which is Human Rights Day. Perfect day to close out, perfect day to be talking to Gaynell, who is a human rights expert and has spent decades at the UN in the Office of Human Rights and has been placed in different places, including Sudan, working on lots of different issues. We're going to talk about how we can reclaim human rights because they're not foreign to us. They're not foreign to the Caribbean. They're not foreign to the Bahamas. And we know that the Bahamas was a part of human rights movements, including the one to end apartheid in South Africa. So let's figure out how we're going to take it back. Details on all of these events, all the dates, the times, the registration links, the locations available on our Luma page. So you want to go to Luma, lu.ma/16days25. It's lu.ma/16days25. Make sure you register. The in-person events, we have snacks. And don't make us shame. We don't want to not have enough. And if we don't have enough, we only can give them to the people who registered. So make sure you register so we know you come in.
Thank you for that. Yes, please register because I'm going to some of the in-person events and I like to eat. So, let's have a count. Thank you both for joining us, for giving us your good Wednesday evening, and for sharing your hard work, your expertise. Any final thoughts before we finish, and where can everyone find you?
Everyone can find me on LinkedIn. I'm based in Nassau for now. I do move around a lot. But final thoughts, no, I applaud Equality Bahamas for doing this and having these type of conversations. And I hope to see much more movement within civil society and the NGO space, not just around an actual disaster, but year round, because I think there's some great opportunities there that we have not fully tapped into. And there's some shared interests and projects there as well that we can definitely collaborate on. So thank you so much for the platform and allow me to contribute to your conversation.
Yeah, I need to be in the Bahamas at some point next year. That's what I've also gotten from this conversation. Y'all are doing a lot of good work. I looked through the link you just shared, Alicia, and y'all did a lot of work, and so that's really good stuff. Y'all can find me on LinkedIn using my name, Yemi Knight. I'm also on Instagram with the same name. That's it. I have an organization called Anchorbridge Environmental. I'll share the contact information for that. Maybe I'll just do it through Jessica if I'm not able to pull it up quickly right now. But I'm always down to do stuff like this, collaborate. And thank you all so much for having me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both. Yes, Yemi, please come to the Bahamas. Help us do some of this work. All right, everyone. Good night.